About to go ahead and get started with the second panel of the day, which is excitingly the grad student panel. So we have a panel, yeah, exactly. Let's
say something about it, but it's available.
We have a brilliant panel of scholars from a variety of institutions. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. They will give their presentations, and then we'll hold all questions for afterward. On our panel, we have Ethan Pena, who is a PhD student in the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. A lifelong South Texan, they hold a Master of Arts in History from Texas State University and a bachelor's degree from Texas A&M University, Kingsville. Their work examines the diffusion of Marxist ideas and frameworks into Chicano intellectual spheres, specializing in Chicano Marxism, North American Maoism, and the political economy of the borderlands. Writing at the intersection of historical materialism and Anzalduan feminism, Ethan's research analyzes the circulation of revolutionary ideologies across time, space, and culture. We also have Jacqueline Guajardo, who's a first-year PhD student in the MALS program here at University of Texas at Austin. Born in Austin, Texas, and raised in San Antonio, on a mission to help others discover what makes her city so special. With a background in political science and an interest in oral histories, she feels empowered by exploring the Chicano archives. Encouraged by her mother to pursue higher education, she found a way to commemorate her mother's hard work, sweat, and tears. Today's presentation will honor her. We have Cada Alejandra Culp, who's a current history PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, focused on Latino education history in the 20th century United States. She attended Texas A&M University for her undergraduate degree, where she majored in history and minored in Spanish and secondary education. She spent several years working as a public school teacher, teaching immigrant students in social studies classrooms, and volunteering with the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights in the Houston area before pursuing her graduate studies. Leslie Ann Torres is a fourth-year doctoral candidate in the Department of History at Texas A&M University. Torres is currently a pre-doctoral fellow for the Andrew W. Mellon and the University of Illinois Chicago Crossing Latinidades Humanities Fellowship Program, a Portal to Texas History Fellow with the University of North Texas Libraries, and a Graduate Research Fellow with the Melbourne G. Glasscock Center for Humanities Research. She received her Bachelor of Arts in History at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley in 2022, and her MA in History at Texas A&M University in 2024. And finally, we have Alejandra Navarrete, who graduated from Texas State's Public History program and is a public educator. Let's give her a round of applause.
One second. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what I was going to talk about and what aspects of my research to talk to you all about, but then I realized Anglos and Mexicans is my favorite book. When am I going to get another time to talk about my favorite book of all time to a captive audience who has also all read the book? So, I hope that you'll indulge me for a second. So I first read Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas in 2018 when I was in the Masters of History program at Texas State. And when I read it, it felt like I was reading about the entire world, about my entire world. By that point, I lived my entire life in the area under Montejano's analysis. So when I read Anglos and Mexicans, I heard strains of stories my grandpa John told me about his father, the Evermill dairy farmer Robert McBride. I remember my high school ag teacher, Mr. Alvarez, who taught me how the palm tree and grapefruit got to Mission. Anglo land speculators trying to entice Midwest Anglos to move there. And so for me, Anglos and Mexicans represents the first time that evidence went deeper than the archive, that it resonated from within. I know that what's written in this book here is correct because I've lived it, and I've heard decades of stories from organic intellectuals who lived more of that history than I have. And so I wound up employing Anglos and Mexicans in roughly 85% of the papers that I wrote for my master's degree. I'll never forget my comprehensive exams. My chair, Dr. Flyley, left me a comment on my first draft that was almost verbatim. Ethan, we know you read Anglos and Mexicans. We know that you love Montejano, but there are other books that you read too. And she was right. She was very right. I had read a lot of other books by that point, but not one of those books answered all of the questions that I had, or at least gestured towards an answer for all of the questions that I had. And so for a work of history to generate such a degree of emotional and intellectual resonance is no small achievement. Rarely does a work of scholarship offer such sustained insight into vexing social problems. And even rarer still is a study that does so in a way that completely reshapes an emerging field, or an entire field, I guess, right? At this point, an entire field. And so Anglos and Mexicans is proven, to me at least, and it looks like, 90 of y'all here, to be one of those works. And I would argue, here's my hot take, that Anglos and Mexicans is as powerful a guide to understanding the underside of, to borrow from Frederick Jackson Turner, the closing of the frontier, as Black Reconstruction is to understanding the entrenchment of racial capitalism in the United States. And so, granted, right, all of y'all know, Anglos and Mexicans was not the first book to attempt a sort of systemic structural account of race relations in the Southwest, but it was among the first to advance such an analysis so forcefully and so coherently and with a replicable model. And so I could keep going on, there's a lot of reasons Anglos and Mexicans stands out as a necessarily instructive piece of scholarship to me, but I'm going to focus on two for right now. The first reason that it stands out is the ambition. Montejano's history of Mexican-Anglo relations since the Alamo is incredibly broad, right? Building from the work of European social historians, Anglos and Mexicans' 150-year wide view covers the Texas-Mexico border region's transition from pre-capitalist or semi-feudal to modern. So in essence, Anglos and Mexicans relates the full process of Texas's incorporation into the world system. And so in that sense, in Anglos and Mexicans, what happens between 1836 and 1986 in the Texas-Mexico border region was really just a local node in the centuries-long violent birth of the modern world. And so the dispossession of Mexican and Tejano land by Anglo settlers was not a repetition of the Lord-served contradiction that propelled European history development over centuries, but instead a permutation of essence manifesting in an alternate form, a race-based labor hierarchy. And so it was while, here's some lore of the book for those of y'all who don't know, but it was while Montejano was a visiting professor at UC Berkeley, against his committee's advice, he still hadn't finished the dissertation, that Montejano found the window in the past that made these bold proclamations possible. It was a chance placement under famed economist Paul S. Taylor's office that led Montejano to use what he calls the gold mine that was Taylor's interviews in early 20th century Anglo merchants and ranchers. And I'm going to say, right, I've read the whole book, but those first two chapters, that 100 years, is to me the best account of the process of historical development that I've ever read. Right, move over the Braudel school, right, because there's Anglos and Mexicans. And so with those interviews, alongside census data, land records, news articles, Montejano constructed a systematized analysis of racial domination in South Texas. He argued, the four periods: incorporation, reconstruction, segregation, and integration. And so, of course, right, taking the European model or the European experience is an inappropriate model for the history of South Texas, as it offers a poor account of ethnic cleansing and race divisions. However, it offered to Montejano, and I think to the rest of us, well-developed frameworks for recognizing the development or the developing relationship between land, labor, and capital. And so, when we look at South Texas, right, instead of English gentry and merchants, there's Mexican hacendados and the Anglo merchant and adventurer. And rather than wool, the enclosing of the peasant holdings, Captain Swing and the levelers, we had longhorn cattle, the enclosing of the open range, and La Cortina and Mexican bandits. And so from the vantage point of Anglos and Mexicans, the King Ranch, for example, I grew up my entire life in the shadow of the King Ranch, went to school at A&I, right? The King Ranch becomes something more than a massive ranch with mythological horse bloodlines. It becomes a somewhat novel manifestation of a semi-feudal mode of relationship to land, labor, and capital. Or, more simply, I guess, Anglos and Mexicans shows that race-based segregation of Chicanos was necessarily predicated on the enclosure of and incorporation of their land into an entirely capitalist economy. And so that brings me to the second reason that Anglos and Mexicans is still, again, to quote Ben Johnson, a reference book, an encyclopedia. It's the clarity of its political commitments. Right? Anglos and Mexicans scope, the aforementioned scope, developed more out of a political and intellectual necessity rather than conscious action. Initially, Montejano's dissertation was more like an ethnographic study of the San Antonio Berets, but his committee did not understand the importance of the Berets, characterizing them as lumpy proletarians and gangsters. So without the literature to validate Montejano's embodied understanding of his world, right, he grew up in San Antonio, he had to prove to a bunch of Anglos that race and class were mutually constitutive. Anglos and Mexicans had to demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mexicans were more than just the mañana spirit. So in painstaking detail, the work corroborates that the reason Mexican farm workers, I don't know, survived entirely on rice and beans was because the material conditions mandated by the labor policies of Anglo settlers, not the other way around. And so, basically, Anglos and Mexicans was a fiery political manifesto meant to force the gringos to finally understand actual Texas history. And so he wrote to render the racist narratives of Mexicans obsolete with irrefutable proof. And so incidentally, in doing so, he provides the materialist foundation for most of the work of everybody in this room. And so I'd argue, at least provisionally, Dr. Montejano, he succeeded in his goal of justifying the study of South Texas as intellectually viable. However, despite the force of his arguments, anti-Mexican or Latino sentiment is as entrenched as ever in our country. Given the ongoing well, I guess I don't know where the sentence is going. Given the ongoing activities of the Trump regime's secret police, parentheses ICE, or I guess further parentheses, the Texas Rangers, the assault on ethnic studies and gender studies at UT and A&M, as well as the general anti-intellectual bias throughout our nation, Anglos and Mexicans' political aspirations of disproving anti-Mexican pendejadas are even more critical today than they were in 1987. So as we gather to hear in celebration and reflection of the work that is Anglos and Mexicans and the work that Anglos and Mexicans made possible, UT's administration is conspiring to consolidate and dismantle Latino, Black, and women and gender studies. The political appointees of the Board of Regents have taken upon themselves the responsibility of saving what they call Western civilization. That means that they intend to erase insurgent intellectuals that threaten their hegemonic narrative, intellectuals like everybody in this room. And so, indeed, actually, just this very moment, as we're speaking right now, right up the street, the Civitas Institute is holding a conference, heavy, facetious air quotes there, on the future of Latinos. This conference is being held with no oversight from anybody in the Department of Latino Studies. None of you are there, right? The serious scholars of Latino life are not there. And so that tells me that the Civitas Institute, the Board of Regents Chairman Kevin Eltief, who himself is a real estate developer, Anglo land speculator, right? Where does that sound familiar from? Provost Inboden and President Davis do not know our history. They do not know Tejano history. And this is something I stole from Paul, but they don't know our history. They don't care to know our history, because when you know our history and when you read Anglos and Mexicans, you don't end up on that side. It's impossible to read Anglos and Mexicans and to understand the history and knowingly reproduce those processes. So from where I'm standing, or I guess sitting rather, from the vantage point provided by Anglos and Mexicans and the work of everybody in this room, every time I say that, I look at you, Dr. Zamora, I'm just like, I can see, with the model that is Anglos and Mexicans, I'm able to see the political machinations of the state that to erase Latino studies are not new. The Board of Regents and the University Administration are simply different actors in a centuries-long drama of Anglo land speculators and lawyers stealing Tejano land. They're going to use every tool available to rewrite the political or peace structure in their favor. Despite their neutral language, their intentions are clear to everybody in this room with critical thinking. Why? Because we've read the history, right? It's right. It's right there. So, in this moment of uncertainty, I ask that all of you here stand in solidarity with us here in Malls, with ads, with women in gender studies. This is what they are trying to do to us is part of something bigger and longer than departments at flagship universities. It's imperative that we save this space, and it is paramount to continue the intellectual and political currents that Montejano and his generation initiated. We have to protect the legacy of Paredes and Anzaldúa. Anglos and Mexicans, the book itself demands that we do not allow the further encroachment of land speculators and lawyers into the home that we built here. So, in the spirit of Juan Cortina, in the spirit of El Plan de Santa Barbara, and in the spirit of David Montejano and Anglos and Mexicans, I want to say that Malls, Latino Studies, Tejanos, we're not going anywhere, and we do not plan to leave. So with that, I want to get off my soapbox and turn it over to my fellow future architects of the future of Latino Studies.
All right.
Alfonso, who's next?
Jackie.
Hi everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Ethan, for the introduction. Today I will be talking about the time I spent with the Orozco family papers archive collection held at the Benson. I was guided to this collection specifically thanks to the help of librarian Maribel Falcon, who pointed out that this was a fairly new collection to the Benson. And so I was drawn to that incompleteness, as I thought it to be a beautiful thing to be able to witness the archive take shape in real time. A book of this collection pertains to the interests and activities of Dr. Cynthia Orozco, who grew up in Pueblo, Texas. The collection covers the active life of her sister Maria Teresa, Sylvia Irma, and her mother Aurora Estrada from the 1970s to mid-1980s, alongside Cynthia's. The letters, articles, clippings, and posters that you find breathe life into this collection. And so I sought theories and methods that recognize the value of community archives. Traditional archives often produce a colonial archive that fragments or erases Chicana histories. And so Chicana feminist scholars have worked really, really hard to reconstruct these histories through community collections, personal papers, and everyday materials. The Orozco family papers exemplify a community-grounded archive that disrupts institutional silences, reshapes our understanding of Chicana activism, and feminist praxis. Dr. Cotera's most recent publication, Flesh in the Archive, which is my version, that book is to me what this book is to Ethan. It exposes the narrative exclusions that have long persisted within both Chicana, and queer of color communities, representing this growing emphasis on everyday practices and viewing them as crucial spaces where intellectual and political labor take shape. The concept of movidas instructs us to read for what is not preserved, what is intentionally momentary, and what is hidden in plain sight across personal collections to combat the colonial archive. So this prompts me to seek out the informal and intimate forms of activism ever so present in the collection. The archive as a whole situates identity formation, political consciousness, and Chicana feminist practice within UT's institutional history. I focused on the findings pertaining to the Chicano Culture Committee, which was a part of the Texas Union Student Center, which housed a variety of student-run committees, and the Chicano consciousness raising group Mujeres Unidas. But for the purpose of this presentation, I focus on how the latter reveals how Chicano student activism at UT from 1978 to 1980 fostered a multi-layered political consciousness within an environment that encouraged greater participation among Chicanos, yet remained dismissive of Chicana involvement. And by moving from formal understandings of participation, we begin to heal from the hauntings of historical prejudice. Orozco was a member of the Chicana consciousness raising group Mujeres Unidas from 1979 until she graduated in 1980. As she describes it, it was a social support system of about 10 women who would meet weekly to speak on topics directly affecting them as it pertained to their role in the movement as women, Chicanas, and students. And these are images from their meeting notes from the very first meeting on January 25th, 1979, attended by Cynthia, Norma Garcia, Valerie Gonzalez, and Amparo Aguilar. In the very first meeting, they all had the space to express what they believed were to be the foundations and objectives. Quote, Norma emphasized the need to speak together as persons and also the desire to abandon the Chicana stereotype. Valerie suggested that the content of the meeting should raise issues pertaining to the Chicana. Amparo adds that books or articles could be incorporated in order to further our education, development, and discussion. Cynthia emphasized the importance of the group in building self-confidence in Chicanos. This, alongside other objectives such as creating an inclusive and respectful environment for all participants, fostering shared responsibility, and expanding their influence beyond the immediate Chicano community and campus. Mujeres Unidas created a contact list in an effort to build a network of mujeres throughout the nation who study various fields or who function in the community. From California to Ohio, these mujeres had interest in different backgrounds such as library science, Chicano history, education, political science, film, etc., and all came from different institutions. On behalf of Mujeres Unidas de Austin, Cynthia Orozco reached out to the Ladies GI Forum Auxiliary. Mujeres Unidas looked to the forum for support in building a broader national network seeking mentorship and guidance through requesting information concerning the forum's goals, services, and membership, as well as copies of any newsletter or bulletins, since it was difficult to learn about others even if they were in the same city. This level of initiative reveals the deep commitment Chicano students had at UT in building networks and forging pathways for themselves and future generations. Their vision extended beyond campus, so by collaborating with the Mexican American Business and Professional Women of Austin, which also has its own archive collection at the Besson, an organization dedicated to uplifting Mexican American women, Mujeres Unidas rooted their activism in the broader Austin community. In 1979, they leveraged their own resources and knowledge to help shape the organization's annual symposium for La Semana de la Mujer, fostering dialogue and collective growth. These efforts reinforced a core principle of their work: activism and learning were inseparable. Through Mujeres Unidas, we witnessed just how difficult Chicano consciousness raising truly was. Context matters. Institutional and historical marginalization in higher education, particularly in Texas, left Chicanas fragmented and isolated. At UT, they were not only confronting the scarcity of Chicano-centric resources within the university, but they were also grappling with a Chicano movement that often failed to address their own gendered shortcomings. They existed in the margins of both the institution and the movement. It was within these layered exclusions that Mujeres Unidas emerged as powerful historical agents. Stepping into the role of educators, they created spaces of learning in the world that had long denied them access. Though not an officially registered campus org, Mujeres Unidas became far more than a bureaucratic absence. It was a support network forged out of a necessity, a collective response to this political invisibility, where Chicanas could cultivate political clarity and affirm one another's intellectual and political work. And the documents pertaining to the Chicano Culture Committee further echo and reinforce this reality. The power of organizing derives from the idea that these actions would establish long-term structural change rather than temporary reform. Organizing is not simply about responding to immediate injustices. It is about building institutions, holding leadership, cultivating leadership, and sustaining collective political consciousness over time. For Chicana activists in particular, organizing meant creating durable networks, as we can see through Mujeres Unidas. And yet, the barriers towards raising consciousness persevered, and Mujeres Unidas, and shortly after Orozco graduated, Mujeres Unidas stopped meeting. Without the presence of such a group, the campus and surrounding community would have lacked critical spaces for Chicanas to explore their identities, assert their voices, and build networks of support. To identify Chicana activism and participation, we must hone in on small and fleeting moments of revolution. So I urge us to find meaning in this momentary existence. Thanks to the Orozco family papers, Mujeres Unidas become internalized, and the memory of its members mark the beginning of groundbreaking Chicana activism to come. Over the next 40 years, the Chicano Studies will struggle with the battle of belonging. This archive has helped prove my existence and the existence of my community, but our ability to belong together is being threatened, and our spaces, both physical and epistemic, are increasingly vulnerable to erasure, defunding, and political hostility. If the archive proves anything, it is this: we are capable of creating belonging for ourselves. We have done it before. We have imagined communities where none seemed possible. We have turned isolation into coalition, marginalization into movement, absence into presence. Our belonging has never been accidental. It has been crafted, defended, and loved into existence.
There we go. Okay, first I just, now?
Yeah,
Okay, good.
you're
Sorry.
fine.
First, I just want to say what an honor it is to be in this room. There are several scholars in this room who taught me when I was an 18-year-old college freshman, fresh out of high school. And I'm sorry they had to read my writing at that point in time. But I hope that with the training that they gave me over my undergrad years and the training and mentoring that they are still giving me now, the scholars in this room whose works I read when I was an undergrad, now in grad school, and in between when I was a high school teacher on weekends in coffee shops. It is such an honor to be in this room with this group of people. And without further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research in relation to David Montejano's framework and oral histories. Okay. In the introduction of his first book, Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas, David Montejano states the following when discussing his source material. The research materials for this work have been drawn from a variety of primary and secondary sources. They include cowboy diaries, travelers' accounts, land purchase records, old-timer recollections, congressional investigations, and the interview material collected by agricultural economist Paul S. Taylor in 1927 to 1930. Since these materials lean heavily on Anglo sources, this is, in a sense, a history from above. The Mexican side of the story surfaces throughout the discussion, but still requires more research. There are a number of places where sources by Chicanos and Mexican Americans depict historical events in their own perspectives are silenced. Montejano acknowledges this. His work is a narrative that is crafted largely from Anglo sources and thus looks to the future of more research that can unearth the Mexican side of history, or the history from below. This is an issue that has faced scholars of Chicano and Mexican American history since the field's inception. Mexican American studies scholar Mario Cotera, Jackie, writes, those further away from the mechanisms of power, women, the working class, ethnic and sexual minorities, are rarely represented in institutional archives. Of course, traditional archival research can and does often unearth rich source material created by Mexicans thanks to the tireless efforts of archivists who catalog the materials as they are made available to them. But the unfortunate matter is that sources from these perspectives often just do not exist, not in the same quantity that Anglo sources do. Sometimes they are silenced before their creation. Higher rates of illiteracy and significantly lower average years of schooling among Mexicans ensured this. Sometimes they are not allowed to be created, as Mexicans were less often in positions of power that allowed them to create documents. Other times, if they were created, they may not have been preserved at the time because they were not thought of being as high enough value. So, there are gaps in the narrative. The Chicano movement is where this starts to change, but most documents and recordings created by their subjects are only from significant historical actors. Of course, we have the primary sources of Dolores Huerta, Chacha Jimenez, and Gus Garcia. But we have records of them only because their actions are significant enough to have disrupted Anglo life in the pursuit of civil rights. We still lack narratives of what life was like for the average Chicano during this time period in their own perspectives. Anglos still dominated the positions of source creation like local officials, newspaper editors, and educators, and so their word is what remains most prominently in the archives. Anglo documents might be enough to tell us what happened to Chicanos as basic facts. Schools were segregated, housing was worse, laws forbade Spanish language in classrooms. But they cannot tell us how they made Chicanos feel, how they affected tiny aspects of individuals' everyday lives, and all the other details that turn historical writing from a list of facts and into a narrative. Montejano's methodology in piecing together class and race relations from census data, almanacs, and other sources represents a skilled analysis of documents which do not put Mexicans at the center. But if this methodology gives us the skeleton, we are missing the flesh. Sources created by Mexican Americans which contain their personal experiences in counties and cities with Anglo-dominant local governments. This is what their value of oral histories comes into play. Oral histories are audio or visual recordings or written down interviews with people who lived through the historical events in the places that are being studied by the historian. There are two massive benefits to using oral histories to strengthen narratives, especially when discussing the perspectives of those who are underrepresented in other primary sources like Mexican Americans are. The first is providing the provincial perspective, or the microscope. In other words, a microhistory. There are few things oral history is better suited for than this. The second is the incredibly specific detail which can be used to strengthen arguments that are already present and give them added emotional weight. There are plenty of reasons that oral histories are critiqued methodologically by historians, and many of them are valid. Memories are not infallible. They can change, stretch, and be misconstrued. The Digital Humanities Project, Memory, Education, and Discrimination, Life for Mexican American Children in 20th Century Austin demonstrates this well. The project largely relies on the oral histories of two brothers, Frank de Leon Jr. and Marcos de Leon. They were a few years apart in age, but they had near identical childhoods. They had the same absent father, the same late mother, the same younger brother. They went to the same elementary school, middle school, high school. They lived in the same houses and spent time in the same community spaces. Yet they had vastly different conceptions of the same events. The elder brother, Frank, mentioned several times throughout his oral history that he did not feel like certain things like the construction and expansion of I-35 or racial conflict affected him or were very present in his life. In contrast, Marcos remembers how I-35 swallowed up a church building that was important to his family, how racial discrimination against him and his brothers was so prevalent that it inspired him to become involved in politics for the rest of his life. This does not mean that one brother was wrong, or that some memories are more valid than others. Rather, I argue that they show how valuable oral histories are in demonstrating how complex and race and class relations are at the individual level. Frank recalls that everybody in his childhood all got along regardless of race, while Marcos remembers Anglo students refusing to sit with him and store owners kicking him and his brothers out of their businesses just for being Mexican. When we take things at a wider lens, we tend to generalize, as world systems theory does with race and class. When analyzing discrimination against Mexican Americans, we cannot just list the documented facts, like educational statistics, which demonstrate poor performance in schools, housing statistics which show poor living conditions, and laws which show explicit discrimination. These things are documented facts, but they are not the same lived reality for every individual. It brings in more of the everyday experience that Montejano's methodology aims for, and strengthens his argument in showing that there are vast racial complexities within communities, not just between them. To Frank, the construction of I-35 really didn't affect his everyday life any more than a child today would consider the construction near their own school as anything more than a slow, constant, boring inconvenience, something occurring from the outside. From a child's perspective, it is difficult to realize that the construction and expansion of highways are the massive, politically significant, and black and brown community erasing events that they are. Instead, they are just something to look at through the school window. Enriching details are another benefit that oral histories provide. Works of urban history, such as Andrew Bush's City in a Garden, Environmental Transformations and Racial Justice in 20th Century Austin, can use maps and data to tell us the statistics on 1950s Austin's black and brown neighborhoods, more dilapidated houses, and unpaved roads. But oral histories can strengthen this. Rather than just using a percentage of what roads were dilapidated in these neighborhoods, we can use the descriptions provided by oral histories to say that every time a car went by in these neighborhoods, the air got thick with dust. Every time it rained, the streets got thick with mud. Students couldn't walk to school under these conditions, or if they did, it was extremely difficult. When describing how Austin slowly became more and more car-centric as construction expanded, we can list the number of roads as they appear by years, or we can say that Marcos de Leon was hit by a car on his way to school, rammed into the air, and rolled down the street as Austin became more car-centric and less safe for Mexican-American walkable communities. We can state the fact that Americanization occurred and the strategies they used in schools, such as giving Mexican students anglicized nicknames, or we can use the example that Marcos de Leon tells us his younger brother did not know until he was a grown adult that his name was Geraldo, not Jerry, because Anglo teachers and community members called him Jerry his entire life because they could not pronounce Geraldo. Or that Marcos de Leon felt by the time he graduated high school, his name had become Marcos, not Marcus. These are the personal connections that oral histories give us through the detail they provide. No critical fabulation needed. When studying periods long past, we must rely on existing interviews, earlier forms of oral history when they are available. Montejano benefits from this throughout his work, especially when utilizing the writings of Julieta Gonzalez, a folklorist who obtained many of her materials by interviewing the people of the Texas-Mexico borderlands, and economist Paul S. Taylor's interviews, among other sources. But these interviews are few and far between. For more recent periods of Mexican-American history, this does not have to be the case. Many of the historical actors of the mid-20th century and onward are still alive today, but that generation is beginning to pass on, especially those who lived through the Chicano movement. They worked tirelessly to push forward the boundaries of civil rights, but their stories were not always recorded in their own words. As historians, archivists, and scholars of this history, it is our duty to collect these stories of these community members so what they fought for will not be silenced once again. Thank you.
Torres.
Is this okay? Can you hear me? Okay.
Can you put it
A
closer?
little closer.
Is this better? Okay. It sounds normal to me, but okay. So thank you, Ethan, firstly for inviting me. I'm super excited to receive that, or I was super excited to receive that invitation. Very excited to be here talking to you all. So this is part of my dissertation research. It's still in the early stages, so keep that in mind. And it's also very limited. There's so much more I wanted to say, but lightning round, right? So today I'll be talking about the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs, particularly the influence that the Hanas and the Hano communities had on this club. I originally got into this research while researching Alina de Zavala because she was a member of the Women's Club of San Antonio, which was a part of the Greater Texas Federation. But then I realized this is very limited, the Hana influence or the Hana involvement in the organization. But then I learned there's so much more that can be said about the discussion of race and ideas of segregation happening at the same time in this organization, even if very subliminally. So I evaluate the role of, again, limited the Hana involvement, but how club members in general contributed to a greater social environment that simultaneously ostracized, exoticized, and pathologized the Hana communities in early 20th century Texas. There were internal debates and concerns about surrounding the Hana communities in this organization. And you can find these within the state federation newsletters, personal correspondence, board meeting notes, and it ultimately culminated in a broad exoticization of Mexican history and influence in the National Biennial in 1928, which was hosted in San Antonio. So through this presentation, I explore the ways in which Anglo and Tejano women contributed to the making of organizational and community life in Texas, even when the latter group remained more so of an influence rather than affiliated registered members. This lens can help us understand how structural and social segregation operated within middle and upper class women's clubs in the early 20th century. So in the late 19th century, many Anglo-American women in Texas developed various social clubs ranging from discussions of Shakespeare to social reform to history. And in 1897, 21 of these clubs in the central and northeastern regions of the state elected to federate, inspired by the National General Federation of Women's Clubs. 2 years later, the Women's Club of San Antonio, which would be the main club hosting the 28th biennial, was founded by members like Eleanor Brackenridge and would join the newly minted Texas Federation of Women's Clubs. By the 1920s, the TFWC included 7 districts across the state. And again, in terms of overt Tejana representation, my research thus far is limited to the De Zavala sisters. According to Federation newsletters, there were approximately 50,000 members by the end of the 1920s. So it's a little bit difficult to locate every single member, especially since every chapter was very localized and had peaks and lulls in involvement in state activities. However, it is possible for me to examine state-facing documents such as the Federation newsletter that did discuss race and Mexicans. And so my research is being led by questions such as which members of the newsletter editors and district chairwomen want other chapters to learn about? Were any of these members that they were advertising a Spanish surname? Which again is not a perfect research angle, but that's where I'm starting at. Who did they want to celebrate? And in what other ways did the Hanas or their communities figure into Federation conversation? So Alina de Zavala, granddaughter of the Republic of Texas's first vice president, Lorenzo de Zavala, regularly appeared in yearbooks for her local women's club of San Antonio in the 1910s. She primarily participated in committees on literature, history, suffrage, and child welfare. And within the Greater Texas Federation, San Antonio's club was organized into the 5th district of the TFWC. And I found no indication in state newsletters that she was a part of district committees, either by volunteering or she was not elected. In fact, newsletters and board members do not contain any reference to De Zavala or any other Spanish surname member at the state level, aside from her younger sister Mary, who attended the National Biennial Conference in New Jersey in 1926. And it was at this 1926 conference that the Texas delegation persuaded the National Convention to come to San Antonio 2 years later in 1928. Preceding the 1928 biennial, white women in the TFWC sometimes debated how to resolve issues that plagued women of color. For example, according to the newsletters published between 1920 and 1928, Each of the 7 districts of the Federation included committees focused on the, quote, conditions of our colored people. It's unclear exactly what research or outreach methods that they pursued, at least to me so far, but the Board of Director meeting minutes of 1921 reveal that sometimes leading members took a particular interest in communities of color, such as College Station-based Maggie Berry, a Texas Federation member who would soon rise to the General Federation ranks. She attended meetings of the segregated Texas Federation of Colored Women's Clubs in 1921 on behalf of the TFWC. At the TFWC board meeting that followed, Berry alleged that when she asked TFCWC members if they would be interested in integrating within the larger TFWC, but allegedly a member explained that the TFCWC did not want to formally integrate, but instead, quote, sought equal opportunity to express ourselves in our race. At the board meeting, Berry reminded members that the TFWC president had sought to, quote, make work with the colored people of the state one of the most important endeavors of the Federation, but that by the advice of the executive committee, this had been postponed until now.
Volume. Some of us are senior citizens back here.
Is this better? Or should I?
Is your mic on?
I don't think it's on.
That was aggressive. I'm sorry I did that.
Sorry about that. Okay. So it's unclear if the executive committee is in reference to the TFWC board or the General Federation of Women's Clubs in terms of responding to TFWC goals to interact with communities of color. At the end of the segment in the board meeting, the minute secretary concludes, it was the consensus of opinion that practical citizenship should, quote, include both Negroes and Mexicans. Berry and the board committee endorsed a motion to provide aid to Mexican and Black communities while acknowledging the concerns raised by Black and Mexican mutual aid societies, which of course were not listed. Yeah, and there's also something to be said about their district committees of the conditions of our colored people. To use the word "our" signifies ownership or paternalism over community leaders, yeah, I'll get to that in a second, but the TFWC continued to discuss issues that specifically affected communities of color. So for example, in 1924, they partnered with the Texas Public Health Organization to eliminate tuberculosis and malnourishment rates affecting Mexicans specifically. And the statewide initiative included the participation of Mexican lecturers to give health literature and illustrated lectures to their people. And again, they're not listed, their names are not listed. Outside of the TFWC, the Hanas were also involved in tuberculosis elimination campaigns. So, like Alina Zavala was involved in the Bexar County Tuberculosis Association. So in this way, there seems to be a precarious balance between genuine and practical outreach methods while also being paternalistic over Mexican leaders. And of course, there were members who were wary of interaction with communities of color. So for example, in 1924, there were internal debates about the Box Bill and Mexican immigration, and it rippled through the TFWC in both private and public ways. So for example, Florence Griswold of the Women's Club of San Antonio implored members to advocate against it, and she did this through private correspondence, both on formal stationery and unofficial stationery, so both on behalf of the club and on her own personal behalf. The 4th District Chairwoman, however, published support for Mexican immigration and for the Box Bill on behalf of her entire district, and this included counties such as Harris County. However, 4 years later, TFWC members across the state were more than happy to showcase local Mexicans during their 1928 biennial convention in San Antonio, in which the local Mexican population became a celebrated cultural ingredient in the city's melting pot. I wish I had so many more pictures, but it's mostly described this biennial conference, and that's the best I could do. It was just an advertisement, but the 1928 biennial convention was a major event for the city of San Antonio, but I did not find any evidence of Tejano leadership in planning committees or in the TFWC or any other committees, at least so far, right? However, the local biennial planning committee did prioritize presenting ethnic diversity in San Antonio, or at least what they felt was genuine ethnic diversity. The 8-day-long convention included goods, music, and art presented by or about Mexicans, Black Americans, Indigenous Americans, and East Asian Americans. They presented, quote, the pungent, highly seasoned foods of Mexicans in the still standing marqueta. They primed and prepped the front yards of the West Side Mexican neighborhood and offered a reward for the best most beautiful yard in the West Side. And they also sponsored a historical data committee that notably excluded Mexico in their retelling of the flags over Texas. So coordinators from the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs marketed and commodified Mexican culture amongst white outsiders, but internally seemed unsure whether or not to actually affiliate with Mexicans at a permanent or genuine scale. That's the end of my thing, but this is a small snapshot of research that can help us more efficiently understand the complex racial hierarchies and politics of inclusion that were operating within these middle class and upper class women's clubs. But thank you so much.
Well, thank you to my fellow presenters. I'll have to touch back to follow. Thank you, Ethan, also for all of this. It's very humbling to be permitted to give a talk here. I'm surrounded by my bibliography. Thank you all. Similarly, this is also my thesis that I just defended last semester that I'm showing snippets of. And when thinking about Montejano's, Dr. Montejano's Mexicans Making Texas, thinking how to gear this research to this topic. I'm like, well, Mexicans were making Texas very red during the Great Depression. And so I wanted to focus on this aspect of my research, which is why it was titled The Most Dangerous Communists Beyond the 1938 Pecan Shelter Strike. And this is in reference to Anniv. And so this project that I endeavored the goal was not to retell the story of the Pecan Shelter Strike, which has a rich scholarship, historiography, for very good reasons, very well documented. Instead, what I was trying to do, my aim was to reframe Anniva's political legacy, her organizing in a national and transnational context, especially in borderlands. Anniv took an active role in political and labor organizing, as we know with the Pecan Shelter Strike. By the time she was 21 years old, she was an experienced organizer, an outspoken communist, and an intellectual who applied Marxist political theory to understand the conditions that Mexicans in the west side of San Antonio found themselves. And she also used this theory to plan these pathways to improve these conditions. And as well, and not just in San Antonio, but Texas at large, and nationally, internationally. Thank you. So focusing on the transnational aspect, something that we don't know too much about was the role that she played with the CTM, La Confederación de Trabajadores de México. This is the largest federation of labor unions in Mexico, established in 1935 under Vicente Lombardo Toledano. And what was interesting with this federation is while they were also working with the AFL and the CIO, they were very, very interested in working in grassroots political labor organizing that Mexicans were doing in small rural communities in places like San Antonio. And so they're going to start reaching out in South Texas, in the valleys with rural workers, and they're going to meet other organizers such as the Saviors, that some of you are familiar with, and they're going to, along with Anniv, establish these extensive networks where we see transnational politics influence the way on-the-ground organizing is happening. And so I wanted to show this clipping because this is a very interesting, unique clipping where Emma Anniv actually talks about her time at the Workers' University. And so the way they were trying to build these transnational relationships was by bringing labor organizers to Mexico to La Universidad Obrera, established by Lombardo Toledano, which was to give training to these organizers so they can take it back to their communities. And so Emma Anniv in 1936 goes to Mexico to study, and she talks about the various courses that she took in Mexican labor movement history, the training. She talks about the professors that she studied under, as well as talking about it's the late 30s, and so there's a lot of politics happening. Communist politics are happening in Mexico and abroad, where she also gives her thoughts, her opinions on, for example, Trotsky coming to Mexico, right? And she's doing this interview along with James Sager. And so this just gives us a glimpse into the way that you guys tapping into these different networks and how she's going to bring them to San Antonio. So after she does this interview, she actually gives a class in San Antonio the next day for anyone to come, because she wants to teach them what she learned in Mexico and how the lessons from the Mexican labor movement can be applied to the specific circumstances of the labor movement happening in San Antonio. This was a fascinating find. In Mexico City, the Workers' University is still there, La Universidad Obrera. The archivist there, very bless that man. The way he is a one-man shop, that archive, the work that he's doing is fantastic. But this is actually a letter from written by Emma Tenayuca to Alejandro Carrillo, who is a leadership member in the CTM and also one of her professors when she was at the Workers' University. And this is 2 years after she had gone to the Workers' University, and she is apologizing because she cannot attend the national convention of the CTM. The delegation cannot attend because they're having a little strike in February of 1938. And so that is why they can't attend, but she does ask them, and Toledano and Carrillo, to send words of encouragement to the striking workers who at this point have been on strike for about 3 weeks. And so again, just the continued networks that Tenayuca, along with the other organizers, with her comrade organizers, the way they maintain these networks, and they continue after, especially when she leaves, demonstrates this. This is one of my favorite finds. This is actually a picture of Toledano, and so while Toledano couldn't attend during the strike, he does come to San Antonio to talk to strikers that summer. So like a few months after the strike ends, along with UCAPWA, they are able to bring him, and he gives a talk in the same plazas where the strikers were giving speeches, where they were holding their rallies. Toledano was able to come, and he is able to, in the next newspaper, he actually was actually a transcript of the speech he gives, and he puts their struggle in the same context of the struggle that Mexicans right in Mexico are going through, and how these are interlinked. All right. Emma Tenayuca's membership of the Communist Party, her affiliation with the Communist Party, is something that is approached with some hesitancy, and rightfully so. However, given I just graduated from Texas State, and I think it's very important to acknowledge the political ideologies that influence and shape the actions and the organizing of people. And so her affiliation with the Communist Party needs to be expanded. The way that it is spoken is usually in, the quote is an academic interest, that she had a slight academic interest, and that she was mostly focused on the communities of San Antonio and improving their conditions, which is true. But it is exactly those connections with those communities that shaped her political understanding, and then as well helped her conceptualize the situation that they were in. And out of the several organizations that Tenayuca is involved with, this is the one that she spends the longest in. And so diminishing that to a slight academic interest is frankly a little, almost, I want to say patronizing a little bit, because she put a lot of thought into the way that she organized, from the few, that we have access to of her words, her thinking. Like, she thought about this deeply, and it shaped a lot of her decisions that she made. So, for example, this is an excerpt from the Daily Worker from April of 1937, and it is talking about Texas, how the Texas branch of the Communist Party is one of the fastest growing during this membership drive. And they specifically name, they spelled her name wrong, but they specifically name Emma Tenayuca as the reason why the Texas branch of the Communist Party is the fastest growing. Because on her own, the membership that she's bringing in was significant. And this is something that challenges this idea that she kept, from what I've seen, that she kept her politics separate from her labor organizing. And so, not only that, they're also funding, in this article, they were funding for a second training school, because they already had a training school, and the first one was in Spanish. And so she is establishing these training schools in both languages, right, as she's increasing the membership of this party, of this branch. This is a letter that she writes in Christmas of 1938, so it's about to be 1939, where she directs this letter to the consular workers, and basically praising, right, the successes of the consular strike. However, something interesting that she says is that while this was, a great achievement that they've done, it was only the first step, right? So it's only the first step into now getting rid of this political machine that's in San Antonio. Right? Un paso que pare el avance del fascismo en Texas. So this is a one step into stopping fascism in Texas, as well as one step forward into implementing socialism in Texas. And so for her, the consular strike and all the labor organizing was very much tied with the way that she conceptualized, right, using Marxist theory. And then I want to leave y'all with this last bit from her FBI file, a very fun read that I highly recommend. But this is from an agent where he says, subject is an open and avowed communist. She is above average and a most dangerous communist, capable of making a great deal of trouble, especially among the Mexican element. She has a manner of appealing to the Mexicans that seems to work miracles with
That's high praise.
It's almost they're praising her in fear. And so I want to leave you with this. She organized with her radical politics in one of the worst economic periods of the country under the rise of fascism, and I think this allows us to remember that Texas has a legacy of radicalism and continues to have a legacy of radicalism.
Great. Thank you all so much. Let's give them another round of applause. We have some time. We started a little bit late, so we're going to make sure that there's time yet for questions from the audience. For any of the participants or the panel as a whole, I'll come around so that folks can hear you. Who wants to get us kicked off? All right.